Hannah Frankman, welcome to Dad Saves America.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, off camera or on another camera, spent a long time with our chairs reversed, you interviewing me about this show and about fatherhood. Now I get to turn the tables and talk to you about your work. And so I'm going to start off. I'm going to lay it out for the audience. So you are the founder of Renegade Educator, which I'm going to ask you about and spend time on. You also are a podcaster yourself, the Hannah Frankman podcast. And you worked for my buddy Isaac Morehouse at Praxis. So among other things, I know you are homeschooled and you're a bit of a radical. So
Slightly.
let's dive in. You know, at the heart of this show is, and the whole name and all of it, is the basic idea that we as men in particular should embrace our role as father, and that it is heroic and that it is essential, and that its absence is really bad for our society. And then the next layer down is, well, what do you do when you're a dad? And a parent in general. And I think one of the biggest decisions we make is how our kids are going to spend their days, which is often in school.
Yes.
And I think most of the time is wasted. But what do you think, Renegade Educator? What is Renegade Educator all about? And how did you end up creating this publication and this enterprise?
I joke at parties that when people ask, what do you do? And I've had a long day, I say I'm in the business of convincing parents to pull their kids out of public school, which is kind of a throwaway answer, but it's also actually the truest answer of all the things I could say. I validate parents' intuitions that something is wrong about the status quo education system. I give them the stats, the data, the information, the anecdotes to back that up, to help them see, okay, it's not just my kid that's struggling in school, it's a systemic problem. I give them resources on all of the other options that are available at their fingertips, a multitude, no matter where you are in the age of the internet. And I help them figure out how to go through the process of figuring out what is the best fit for my child and for my family. Like, how do you actually choose a school? I like to joke also that I'm a product of what I preach, and I've kind of been in the alternative education world since I was like 3. I've been in training forever because I went to a private Montessori inspired preschool and kindergarten and then was homeschooled 1st grade through 12th grade. So this is something that's very, very close to my heart. Public school is not kind to children. It crushes their creativity. It crushes their curiosity. It crushes their sense of optimism about the world, about their future. It is an enormous waste of kids' time. Kids spend approximately 15,000 hours in school between grades K through 12. You're supposed to take 10,000 hours to become an expert in something. Kids spend 15,000 hours and are good at almost nothing by no fault of their own, and no fault really of the teachers in the classroom. It's the system that's broken. It's a colossal waste of the potential of childhood for kids to be in school. And I want to help as many families as possible feel empowered and knowledgeable and courageous enough to pull their kids out and find something else.
All right, I'll keep this quick. If you like what you're hearing and want to hear more, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our new content as it comes out every week. And now, back to the conversation. I'm with you. Like, my priors are there. I went to 12 years of Catholic school, and then I put my son in a plethora of school models: Waldorf, Montessori, Catholic, Acton Academy, back to Catholic. So I'm like Mr. School Choice with my own kid. So I've walked the walk on alternative schools. The only thing we didn't do is homeschooling, although the criticism of Acton is, oh, it's like homeschooling if you've got a little bit of extra money to put them somewhere else to be homeschooled. I take that not as a criticism at all. When you say public school, what are you actually talking about? And because there's like 15,000 school districts, and theoretically they're locally controlled. So is it really one thing, or is there variation within the public school system that's worth paying attention to? Number one. And then number two, what's broken about all of it, or the parts that are especially broken? Like, let's dive deeper into that.
You're basically asking me to tear apart the entire thing. Like, the list of things that are broken is...
We got time.
We're going to need it. Let me give a little historical context first, because I think that sets the stage. Because in 21st century America, the only thing we know in living memory is the public school system, very close to how it exists today. You have school districts all across the country. There's state oversight of the districts. There's the Federal Department of Education that's been around since the 1970s. The public schooling model was pretty much universally adopted by the early 20th century. Your parents went to it, your grandparents went to it. It's likely that your great-grandparents went through it. Like, nobody remembers going to a one-room schoolhouse anymore, being locally educated. If you do that, you're weird. Like, and that's how every generation that is still alive thinks about it. So it feels like this very status quo thing. Like, this is just how it is.
This is the way you learn.
Yeah, it's the way you don't learn. I'm not just going to throw around bold, juicy statements. I'm actually going to back all of this up. For the majority of human history, that is not how we learned. For the majority of human history, we didn't have recorded history as we know it now. And children learned and grew up and became functioning members of their tribe or their society just fine. And then over the course of more modern history, most people were educated on a local level. There never was a national institution of education. And then in the mid 19th century, America was expanding very quickly. Mm-hmm. It had a very large influx of immigrants who came from very disparate cultures, very disparate places. Everybody homogenizing nicely was not necessarily organically happening as quickly as people wanted, particularly in the Northeast and particularly in Massachusetts. There were concerns about how well all of these incoming immigrants were going to integrate into American society. And so the first stab at designing a more centralized education system was embarked upon. And by the early 20th century, it was put into place across the country. It was designed to be a system. It was designed to be as cohesive and as consistent as possible. And so it was also designed to educate kids at scale.
At one level, that makes a lot of sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have a lot of kids.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a lot of kids coming into the society.
Mm-hmm.
You could say, well, we got that happening right now. We got a lot of immigration in the country. And you want there to be a culture that's
mm-hmm.
a thing, right? So how are you going to do that and have some notion that a minimum standard is being delivered, right? Isn't that seems fair? Seems like reasonable goals.
It sounds very humanitarian, honestly. You're going to educate children who wouldn't necessarily have access or resources to education. Otherwise, you're going to mandate that it is paid for by the government. So even if your family doesn't have any resources to put towards education, your child will still get they'll have an equal opportunity to education. It sounds very noble. In practice, it works very poorly. There were a couple sort of prerogatives of the way the system was set up in the first place. One is that it had to be scalable. So you had to have a fairly substantial number of kids in a classroom, like pretty high student to teacher ratio, because you need to be able to staff a school and educate kids at scale. And so you have 20 to 30 kids in a classroom. You're dividing them by grade level so that the teacher can focus on instructing everybody in the class at the same time. But children do not all learn at the exact same pace. You don't come with factory settings. It's like, okay, on day 183 of being a 7-year-old, you're going to be ready to, learn how to divide something. Like, it doesn't work that way. And so the needs of the children inside the classroom are never being universally met. It was also designed to be sort of a bridge between childhood and the rapidly industrializing world. So it was intended to train kids for gainful employment and integrate all of these children of immigrants into being useful members of the adult workforce. And so it was not intended to cultivate curiosity, creativity, any of the virtues that we really appreciate in innovative and industrious people. Those things aren't useful. And so none of those were put in the equation at all.
I've been going back and reading John Taylor Gatto's Weapons of Mass Instruction.
Fantastic book.
There seems like there's two threads as he lays out. And I'd love for you to expand on this from all your work, which is you have this Prussian system established under Otto von Bismarck that is very much a produce willing cannon fodder and loyal Prussian citizens as its North Star. Pledge allegiance to the flag, Nazi-style salutes, and all that kind of stuff. Then you also have, I think, the Rockefellers and other players in American industrial society, which is very particular to the time of the beginning of the assembly line, which we aren't living in anymore, actually. But there's this sense that, like, oh, how are we going to have people get into these almost widget-like jobs? Let's turn them into widgets. And that's seen and talked about quite explicitly. Like, let's knock off the edges here. And the third piece of the puzzle, as I understand it, is this is the dawn of the progressive era. And so you have this, like, early trust the science, eugenics. We know how to create the perfect man. You look at like the art at the time and like the World Fair, and it's all got this sort of kind of optimistic futurism that also is like a kind of creepy totalitarian worldview at the same time. Is that how you see this mix going on? Like, how do you understand the different forces at work at the birth of public education in the U.S.?
So Horace Mann, who's the granddaddy of education in America as we know it, was responsible for the inception of the public education system in Massachusetts, which is where the forefront of public education across America was established. He went to Prussia to study the Prussian education model, which, as you said, it was intended to build a cohesive society where everyone was a good Prussian citizen and would be a willing member of the military. Its ideal graduate was someone who didn't think too hard for themselves, because if they did, they might say, well, why am I going to fight in this war, and why am I going to be cannon fodder? That doesn't sound like a good life. What if I want to be a farmer or a writer or a poet? Those types of divergent thinkings are not helpful to a system. A system always cares about the sustaining of said system. That's its number one priority. So if you're causing problems for the system, not good. And so that was very explicitly lauded as the gold standard of what education ought to be. And in the late 19th, early 20th century, how we should educate our children was actually like a very popular thing to discuss. It was like a very common conversation topic, much more than it is today. Like, it was fashionable to have an opinion about it. And so people were actively thinking about this. And it was much more part of the cultural milieu. Now we just kind of assume, well, the Department of Education exists and this is how we've always done it, even though that's not true. The average person doesn't have strong opinions about which modality of education is the best and which pedagogical approach is superior. Should we teach kids through the Socratic method? Should we teach them with a teacher in front of the classroom lecturing, or should we use AI-driven apps that can, help each kid learn at exactly their pace? Should we have kids with a teacher in front of the classroom at all, or should we have them doing independent work cycles like in Montessori classrooms where, 4 and 5-year-olds are working all by themselves without any adult intervention? Like, nobody had opinions on these things, or nobody has them now, or very few people do. It's kind of like a weird fringe area of interest. But at the time, people had opinions about it. But there was this sense of like, we were building towards a rapidly industrializing world, so you had to be effective at being on the assembly line or working a rapidly industrializing job in order to fit into the emerging economy. So I think you're right. The forces were very, very explicitly pulling strings within the development of the education system. And when you go back and read the literature, it's very explicitly there. No one was hiding it.
Yeah, that's one of the things that's kind of great about that time, is that now we just publicly lie about everything we do by naming it the thing that's the opposite of its purpose, like the Patriot Act. Oh, it's patriotic to shred our constitutional rights in the name of distant villains that maybe we created for ourselves. So we'll call that the Patriot Act. But back then it was like, oh no, what are there free black people coming to compete with me? We should raise the minimum wage so that they can't get jobs. And they would say it out loud. Now it's like, no, I care about workers. So that's the one that's good, is that there's a written record of these intentions. It's not like these things that sound radical, we're making up and guessing their intentions, right? Yeah. How much what have been some of the sources that you've relied on to understand this history?
I mean, there's been an extensive amount of writing done on this subject. You can go back and find the founding documents and like original manifestos of a lot of these organizations that were the front runners of the education departments that we have today. You mentioned John Taylor Gatto. He's done an amazing job documenting both the history and, as you referenced, like he's pulled a lot of quotes from these original sources of what was happening at the time to really lay out how did we get here. And for those who aren't familiar with John Taylor Gatto, he was a public school teacher in New York City for, I believe, 30 years. He taught English in all different, like, you know, every type of neighborhood you can imagine throughout New York City.
And was like award winning.
Yeah, he won Teacher of the Year twice in a row. And the second time he accepted the award and resigned from his position in the pages of, I think, the New York Times, the New York Times or Wall Street Journal. I can't remember which.
Yeah.
And he wrote this basically manifesto about, he called it a 7-lesson school teacher. And he was explaining why he felt like, you know, he had gone into teaching because he wanted to do good. He wanted to help young people. And he's like, I am doing anything but helping young people. I need to go find something else to do. I can't justify this career anymore. And he was laying out, so he did a really great job laying out both the historical precedents, but also the very modern manifestations of all of this. He talked a lot about, you know, I'm not teaching kids academic subjects. I'm teaching them obedience. I'm teaching them very conditional self-esteem where their sense of self-worth is being dictated to them by a teacher. I'm teaching them their class position and how they stack up against other kids and to think about themselves in terms of test scores. It was really quite scathing. And there have been a number of people over the 20th century who have written really great critiques of what the education system was and was becoming. Ivan Illich has a great book called Deschooling Society where he talks about sort of this underbelly of what education as we know it is doing to us. John Holt is a very well oft-referenced writer who wrote a lot about what the education system was doing to children, but also how children actually learn and why that's completely at odds with what happens in public school, which we can get into if that's of interest. There's a lot of both data and research there, and also just like kind of black and white contrast of like, here's what we do, here's what actually works. These two things don't equate at all.
One of the things that I think holds back a broader appreciation of just how fundamentally rotten this whole approach to education is the adult sense that, hey, I'm here. Like, north of 85% of Americans went to public school. Mm-hmm. They're now adults. They're living lives. And they look back, I think, largely with rose-colored glasses and say, I turned out okay. So how bad could it be? So what's your answer to the parent who says, oh, this sounds radical. And like, I went to public school and I turned out fine and it was fine. And, you know, school always sucks. Like but they got to go somewhere. They got to learn how to read, write. What's your answer to that parent?
Well, I always have empathy when I'm answering that question. I come up against this a lot because this is like very in the cultural milieu. It's hard to just say like the system is broken because it's not just saying like, I got a bad education. You know, it's flying in the face of, well, my parents chose to send me there, so they must have been wrong. Right. And my friends all went to public school. And so I'm saying that they all had bad educations across the board. Like, it gets very socially messy very quickly on a personal level to start dissecting this. I come from a family of obviously my parents homeschooled me, but my grandmothers on both sides worked in the education system. I have great aunts and uncles and, you know, second cousins who all were public school teachers. So like, I get it. It's a hard conversation to have. Yeah. But
I literally popped in my head, you're like the redheaded stepchild.
I'm
like,
pretty sure I wasn't.
I'm just going to say it because why not?
Pretty sure I'm not adopted. My parents insist.
You got half of that euphemism correct.
Yeah, I know. I'm stretching it now. I think there's layers to this. So one is it has gotten worse. It's not the same school system that you likely went through, especially if you were going through the system in like the 90s, the early 2000s, pre No Child Left Behind. There's been a very sharp shift over the past couple of decades towards emphasis on standardized testing. So the way school funding works is it's tied to test scores. And schools are incentivized to do better by having their funding hinge on how well their students do on their standardized tests. And you would think that if a school has poor test scores, that would mean they're struggling and more money should be funneled in. But some of their funding is actually tied to how good they do on a test. So they are incentivized to really push standardized test prep throughout the year. So a lot of the curriculum is just drill and kill for preparing to take standardized tests. And so kids are not doing the same things in school that they were doing 20 years ago. At the same time, test scores are dropping, but there's some crazy charts. I've tweeted these a few times where grades are actually going up. Like if you just look at grades across the country, like they're trending upwards. It looks like kids are doing better, but test scores are falling, which means that grades are just being inflated to make everybody feel like, okay, like our students are doing very well, but test scores are across the board trending down.
Doesn't that, okay, so I want to zero in on that for a sec.
Yeah.
Isn't that actually an example of standardized tests having utility?
Because you can see the scores dropping.
Right. Because in a world where you've got this subjective thing, like let's just take an English class, and there's all this variability, and the kids all have to write their essays and do their book critiques. Is this an A minus? Is this a B? What is that? Is it, should I just do pass fail? But does that mean, what's that mean? Isn't that at least, if not wonderful, at least somewhat of an endorsement of having some over time metric to be able to understand the direction of things?
Sure, if you're going to have a system like this, then having standardized testing within it is useful to see metrics like that. If you're going to be inside of the system, being the operative word here, yeah, there's an argument to be made. I'm not saying that we should keep public education and just abolish standardized testing. That's not my hill at all. I don't want to die on it. I don't even want to climb it. Like I don't want to be near it. That's not my thing.
Okay.
The entire system is the problem. When you start stepping outside of the system, the test scores stop mattering. Example of this. So there's a very innovative school here in Austin called Alpha School. There's a lot of very innovative schools in Austin.
Yeah.
It's a real hot spot for
I've tried
education.
as many as I could within one child's life.
Well, Alpha it's a great school. It's based in downtown Austin. They don't have teachers, very similar to like a Montessori model, an Acton model. There's a lot of different things emerging that are very clear cut. Like we don't have teachers. We have guides who are there kind of to coach the kids, but they're not doing in front of the classroom lecturing or teaching.
Sage on the stage, as my academic friends like to say with scorn.
Yes, no sage on the stage. Kids are learning all of their academic topics in the morning, using basically learning apps. So they're using software tools and now a lot of AI to help them learn all of their academic subjects. And they spend their afternoons either learning life skills, or when they're in high school, they build projects called masterpieces, where there's one recent graduate as of, this June, who her masterpiece was building a Substack newsletter, like a paid Substack newsletter for parents, talking about like educating your kids, but from the teenager's perspective, like all the insider baseball and like, here's like why your teen won't talk to you kind of thing.
Sounds like a good guest for the show, actually.
She would be amazing. There was another one, also a recent graduate, who created a documentary on cancer being a foodborne illness, where she like actually went out and interviewed scientists and stuff and academics and put together a full feature-length documentary on it.
Yeah.
So kids working on like really meaningful things, but they have an emphasis on testing because they're trying to prove that this model works. So if kids are scoring well on tests and doing this other stuff, it kind of flies in the face of everything that people think school has to be. And so inside of that model, the test scores matter because they're using it to prove that the academic side is working and kids aren't wasting their time by spending like 5 hours out of their 7-hour school day working on a documentary instead of like learning algebra. So within isolated models, there are utilitarian purposes for this, but I would argue, and I know this is going to be a radical take for some parents, like bear with me. You can choose to disagree with me at the end, but like I think this is at least worth hearing out. I don't think standardized testing has any utility for the average child. I don't think that the average child should be in the public education system, and I don't think that if they are not in the system, like there's no purpose anymore for standardized testing. Like, it doesn't really matter where your kid stacks up. What matters is your kid's life outcomes, right? Like, as a parent, that's what you care about. You're not going to say my kid got a 1500 on the SAT for the rest of their life. You're not going to be at a dinner party when your kid's 25 and be like, so how's Cassie doing? It's like, well, she got a 1500 on an SAT, remember? You're going to be like, she's, working this job or starting this business or writing this novel, and I'm so proud of her because she's doing these things. You care about,
she's got 3 beautiful kids.
Exactly.
And
like,
they're all thriving.
Is she in a happy relationship? Does she have a vibrant community? Does she live in a place that she loves? Is she doing work that's meaningful and sustains her, whether that's being a mother or whether that's building a company? Like, is she doing something that translates to being success in life? Like, that's actually what we care about. And standardized tests don't measure for that, and they don't even really predict for it. So why does it matter for the average kid? It's a tool of the system, it's at the expense of the student, not for the benefit of the student. I don't know if that argument sold anyone, but I think it's at least a question worth considering.
If standardized testing is worthless or useless in the grand scheme of I want to raise an adult that can live in a free society and thrive and have a great life after their parent is dead, how do I know if my choice is good? Do I have to literally roll the dice?
No.
And then, well, you know what? They turned out to be like a burnout living under a bridge. I guess I shouldn't have homeschooled them. Like, how do I know along the way if what's happening is good?
So I think you have to think in very first principles from the onset about what you actually want for your child. Again, like, most parents want their children to grow up and be happy, financially stable, successful in some capacity, doing things that they love, and surrounded by people that they love. I think most parents would agree that anything that they want for their child, for the most part, falls under that umbrella, with the exception of parents who have very big ambitions, like my kid's going to be the next Mozart or whatever. Like, most parents, it falls under that umbrella. And then you have to work backwards and say, okay, what is the through line between my child at infancy or toddlerhood or entering their kindergarten year and they're beginning this journey of education and that at the end? And I'm going to answer this in a roundabout way first,
Sure.
but I think there's a couple more caveats that are also important, and then I'm going to answer it directly. When you're doing that backwards facing sort of assessment of the through line, when you're plotting sort of what are the mile markers along the way that we're doing this right? You also, there are a few assumptions that you have to call into question right away. I talk a lot about the college thing. Should you or should you not? To college or not to college? That is the question.
Should I endeavor to be the parent that sets my kid up to throw themselves over that gulch at Cornell?
Okay, well, we know what you think about it. Most parents aren't quite as clear cut.
But for those of you that don't know, Cornell, which is Ivy League, has a gulch that is when I visited Cornell, and it was oh yeah, well, this is a lot of students throw themselves over this gulch.
That's so horrifying. That's not what parents want when they're thinking
it's
about
not what
success
they
of their
want.
child. That makes me very
sad. Some of them
sad.
induce it with the pressure they put to get into Cornell and places like it. But yes, I digress. I'm being unfair. But I can't unexperience going to Cornell and having the suicide gulch pointed out to me.
That's
why did you show this to me?
That's so sad.
You can have an okay college experience that doesn't involve throwing yourself over a gulch.
Some people have great college experiences, but it's not you have to ask yourself from the onset, is this a necessary step in my child getting to destination Z, which is them being happy and fulfilled and doing work that they love and with people that they love? Is college a necessary stepping stone? And I talk about this from the beginning, even when I'm talking about early childhood education, because the entire K-12 system is set up for the payoff to be getting accepted into a good college. The entire thing, each grade is preparing you for the next, right? It's all building on itself. The whole pivot point of the entire thing is your SAT scores in your junior year and your college acceptance in your senior year. Everything else is working towards that.
Yeah.
And so
You really feel it in high school in particular.
you do,
It all
but
starts to come to a head.
there are college preparatory kindergartens. Like, people start thinking about this from the very beginning.
New York City has a lot of pathologies, and this is one of them.
You have to ask yourself if that's important, because it frees up so many possibilities in K-12 if you don't absolutely need your child to go to college. You will, like, you know, it's great to keep the option open because you want your child to decide for themselves what they want to be. Maybe they want to be a doctor. Maybe they want to be a lawyer. Maybe they want to do something that doesn't require college, a type of college degree or certification, but they're just really excited to go study something. And it's like, okay, like, you have a good reason for doing this, go do it. But if that's not necessary, then you can start thinking very creatively. Like, the mile markers aren't even anymore, am I learning things and building a transcript, or like basically spending K-12 in doing resume building to get into college. Like, if that doesn't matter anymore, if those aren't the markers of success either, it's not just test scores. It's like, okay, does my kid have enough AP classes, and you know, are they doing enough extracurriculars that they're going to impress a college admissions board? If you take all of that off the table, you can paint a much clearer through line between child as future adult being happy and successful in life. And the things that set you up to be successful in college are often at direct odds with the things that set you up to be successful at this destination Z, being happy at life thing.
Such as?
Peter Gray, who you have, I believe, had on the show.
I interviewed him for the film that sort of was the proto version of Dad.
Oh, amazing. Okay, so I know you'd spoken to him.
Yeah, we sat down at length for several hours, actually on the Brown campus in the library. We're gonna actually probably release that interview on our Dad Saves America Substack later this year. Amazing.
So you've spoken to Peter Gray. He conducted a study when he pulled his kid out of public school and sent him to a Sudbury school. Sudbury Valley, democratic school. Kids are making their own rules and determining what they want to work on. There's no teacher telling you what you have to do. He conducted a study of about 80 graduates of the Sudbury Valley model because he wanted to know about their life outcomes. And he was very surprised to find that, in spite of what you would think, these kids that had never had real school and never had a teacher telling them what to do, most of them were gainfully employed. They were above average in terms of financial and professional success. There was a disproportionate amount of like artists and musicians, but they were like making money doing it. They weren't just living in their parents' basements. Like, they were actually good at being like artist business people. And the through lines for them were they had always maintained their curiosity. So they knew how to learn. So they knew how to acquire skills that they needed when they needed them. They were able to learn to the task, not just learn to the test, and use that as an iterative process. When you're learning, your knowledge is building on itself. So you always have to be learning new things. And they were able to do that in a self-directed manner. They were curious, so they actually wanted to learn things. And they were highly creative. So they were able to say, I am interested in doing this thing. I'm going to go figure out how. I have this vision in my head of a business I want to build, or an art project that I want to create, or a dress I want to design, or a play I want to throw. And they were able to see it. They were able to imagine it. They were able to figure out all of the component parts of creating it. And then they were able to actually execute on it and do the thing. And those are the markers that school doesn't like because they're very intangible. They're very hard to measure. But your child's creativity, their curiosity, their ability to learn in a self-directed manner, their self-discipline, their ability to sit down and do something without someone else telling them to do it, their ability to have a work ethic and actually complete tasks and do things that are hard, those are all things that directly translate to how successful you are in the real world. School doesn't measure them. School is directly at odds with them in many ways because you can't be self-disciplined in school because you're super focused on writing this essay and your teacher's like, you're supposed to be doing geometry. Like, what are you doing? You can't stay focused. You have to stop and do something else. If you're too creative, you're disruptive. You're bothering the rest of the class. So school doesn't measure those things, but those are actually the skills that make a measurable difference in your adulthood, of like how effective you're able to be in the real world, which is actually what parents care about.
You had mentioned at the outset, basically, and you've reinforced it here, this question of curiosity. And I had Michael Strong on the show, and I believe it was Michael that pointed out something to the effect of, children prior to entering school ask something north of 20 questions a day. And by something like third grade, I might be getting some of these numbers a little off, but the spirit I'm getting right. That number of questions asked goes to 0. So if the most basic notion of what it means to be curious is asking questions, why? What's this? How does that work?
Not now, Johnny. We're talking about Abraham Lincoln. You can't. We'll ask that later. That's the response again and again.
So yeah, is that what else have you seen to that effect that gives you the reason that you can confidently say that traditional public school kills curiosity?
Well, the data's there. When you look at, to the point that you just referenced that Michael made, when you look at the number of questions being asked, there are studies that have been done on this, just like, monitoring children and counting how many times they say something that has a question mark on the end. The number drops dramatically in the early schooling years. Kids are hardwired to be curious. They're hardwired to learn. We wouldn't survive as a species if we didn't learn things. So they're hardwired to be like, why do we do that? And how do I do that? And this didn't work. How can I do it better? But that behavior is punished inside of school. So they stop asking because it's reinforced again and again that you shouldn't. And simultaneously, it's not just that the behavior is punished, it also becomes less fun to ask questions because you start experiencing learning as this very coercive thing. And so, like, why would you do that for fun, too? Like, you want to go do something else. You want to dissociate it from it, not do more of it. So the studies are there that the lines trend downwards. Parents don't want the curiosity to be quashed. Parents don't want any of the negative outcomes of school. And it's not their fault either. Like, they grew up in it. Their parents grew up in it. It's not the teacher's fault. Like, most teachers are going into classrooms because they want to do good and they want to help kids. They're not going in for the pay. They're going in because they think that it's meaningful work and they want to help children grow and learn and thrive. And that's very noble work. It's a noble ambition. It's just that the system is so flawed and we're so entrenched in it that it's very hard. Like, you really have to step outside of it to see, wait a second, if it doesn't have to be this way, then why is it this way?
One follow-up question people could have is, okay, yeah, the Sudbury Academy sounds interesting, and it also sounds like maybe a bunch of creative hippie parents put their creative kids into the creative hippie school.
There's a little bit of that going on.
So there's a selection bias is one thing with that one in particular, I think. But also, like, well, most people aren't creative. So this is all great. You guys are two creatives talking about creativity. But, a lot of people are going to work and they're going to get like a normal job at like an insurance company or, working in a call center or working in construction or at a hospital. And all this creativity talk is like just one part of all the skills and stuff we care about our kids getting. And so why are you so focused on creativity and curiosity?
Creativity isn't just being an artist or being an intellectual. Being creative permeates everything. It's what makes us human. If you're an insurance salesman, you have to get a little creative in how you close a deal. You're talking to somebody and they have an objection. You might have scripts for how you respond to different things, but it's your human touch of knowing what tone of voice to use, what things to say, what answers to put out, what suggestions to posit that is going to close the sale. That's creative work. A machine can't do that yet, but that's what makes us human. Creativity is not this like very 0 or 1, like you either have it or you don't, you either are or you aren't. Most work has elements of creativity, even if it's not the things that we culturally consider to be like, oh, you're a creative. But also children are inherently creative. And you see it when you watch a child play. Every child plays. And it's creative play. It's imaginative play. They take cardboard boxes and they build a castle. That is creativity. An adult doesn't look at a cardboard box and go, oh, that would make a great castle. You know what? If I had another box and then like a little turret, this would be like a fortress. That's like a cardboard box does not suggest castle. A child has this creative impulse that allows them to take the things in the world around them and use them to role play the things they see in the adult world, which is how they're hardwired to train for adulthood. They're practicing being adults by playing. And that play is inherently imaginative.
This is Peter Gray speaks to this a lot.
He does.
And that he says it's that play that's truly functional and truly works is freely chosen, and self-directed. That I, as a child, I'm all right, I got home from school, I go outside, no one's telling me anything. I have to decide with my friends what I'm going to do to have fun. And it's in that moment that actually you're learning more about everything about being a human than all the time you spent sitting waiting for the bell to ring every 45 minutes.
And that's inherently creative. And in the same way as an adult, when you're choosing what job you want to work and where you want to live and who you want to spend time with and how you want to spend time with them and what you want to do with your Saturday afternoon, all of that is creative in differing capacities. But the more you cultivate the natural instinct towards creativity, the more you can intentionally harness it as an adult to figure out, okay, these are like the things that I like. This is what brings me joy. This is what feels meaningful to me. This is what I want my life to be like. And you can figure out how to get there. That requires creativity, even if you're not going to be an artist. So I think creativity is the last thing on the planet that you want to say, well, only certain people are creative. It's not. It's inherently human. And the more of it you can cultivate, the more directly it correlates with your ability to design the life that you want.
One of the things that I have learned in becoming and being now for, since 2011, truly an employer, so where I have to hire people and sometimes fire people, is that the particular skills turned out to not be the best thing to hire against as a criteria. Mm-hmm. In fact, the way we do our job descriptions are the skill set list that we'd like to be able to see mastered at some point as soon as possible after being hired are like at the bottom of page 2. And at the foreground is a set of very simple, I would even call them ethics: integrity, curiosity, conscientiousness, commitment, and perseverance. And that what I've learned imperfectly, because this is always a learning process, is what I try to do and we try to do here is tell me a story about how you used this capability of having perseverance. Tell me a story of perseverance from your life, or tell me, when integrity mattered, or when you had to face a choice that required you to really know what it means to do the right thing. And I don't know how to construct some kind of standardized test for stuff like that. How do you think about the intersection between school? I want to get into some other like technical details and choices people should make, but at the biggest possible level, I think what parents can sometimes feel is, well, I'm going to raise them to have these qualities, and then I'm going to send them to school to learn academics. So isn't that like the stuff we're talking about, these big human personality capability things, isn't that just, that's what you get at home, and then you go to school to learn how to read, write, and do arithmetic and a bunch of other boring stuff that you'll forget? Isn't that okay? Isn't that fine? Isn't that right? Like, are we conflating education and the rest of child rearing by judging school for its failures like this?
It's a fair question. School takes up more of a child's day than any other activity that they partake in. So you already have just the, effective, this is the thing that your child spends the most time on. So these are the habits they're going to get the most ingrained. School is also the place where children tie a lot of their self-esteem because they're praised for doing well in school. They're praised for being smart and for having good grades. Kids don't have a self-esteem attachment to playing, but they do to school. And as they're growing and developing, they know that they want people's respect and admiration, that means something. And so they start to develop themselves around the things that they're being praised for. So school has a disproportionate effect on their development than other things that they're doing. Some kids are just water off a duck's back. Like they just don't care. They're like completely impervious to it. But the average child, it shapes them quite a bit. They're also learning things in school. It's not just that, well, you can learn these things elsewhere and then like you can learn the character stuff at home and then you learn the academics at school. The way that school is structured directly contradicts the behaviors that a child needs to be engaging in to develop the character stuff. Like if they can't ask questions in the space that is supposed to be where you go to get knowledge, if you get in trouble for interrupting class because you're curious, that lesson that they're learning in a social environment where their peers are making fun of them for being, wow, well, you're just a nerd. And the teacher is who holds the keys to what's on your report card that your parents are going to judge you by is saying, well, you're misbehaving for interrupting us. You're not going to ask questions anymore. So the stakes inside the classroom are so high, and it's teaching things that are directly contradictory to what a child needs to be doing to develop these character traits. If your child loves reading books and then just like wants to read novels and write stories all day, and then they're told, well, you can't do that right now because you're in class, and then they get home and they're exhausted and they have homework, like they're just never going to do this thing that they love anymore. It all gets quashed. But you're also
one thing on that front, again, from I can't remember who I'd spoken to, but the level of interest in a subject declines precipitously as kids continue through school. So
there's
the young
also,
kid that my understanding is that multiple studies have found that like the young child who's really excited about marine biology and might want to be a scientist, 5 years into school, it's dead.
I actually have a personal anecdote about this. So I grew up homeschooled, skipped college. About a year after I graduated, I landed a job at a startup apprenticeship program called Praxis. You mentioned Isaac Morehouse earlier. Worked with them for a few years. That's where I got into like the business world. So I always tell people, it's like I skipped college to go work in startups, but there was this year-long gap where I was trying to figure out, I knew college wasn't it, but I didn't totally know what I did want to do. And I was trying my hand at like some freelancing. I actually thought for a while I wanted to be a filmmaker. So I was like, I bought a camera and was trying to learn about videography. I did a little bit like freelance marketing work, but I also started teaching writing. I taught my old homeschool groups. I started teaching creative writing, and then one of the moms ran an after school program for public school kids, and she hired me to teach a creative writing class at the after school program, and I was so excited. It was like such a cool thing to get to do.
Why did you think you would be good at that, being such an uneducated like oaf?
Well, I had always loved writing, and that's what I always I did my schoolwork, but then I just wanted to write. So I wrote every day for years and years, most of my middle and high school education. And I ran a writing group when I was in middle and high school. And then I was the editor of a statewide literary magazine for homeschoolers when I was in my senior year. So I had a background both in writing, but also editing other people's things, coaching up other writers. So I was I feel like this applies.
You had work product.
I did. And the moms saw it and they were like, can you teach our kids to like writing? And I was like, challenge accepted. So I taught the homeschool kids first, and we did a semester long writing course. And it was a really cool entrepreneurial experience for me, but it also was it was just so much fun because basically the moms hired me because they none of their kids wanted to write. And they were like, somehow Hannah's mom got Hannah to like writing. So can you teach that to our kids? And so my entire goal was just you're going to write short stories and you're going to think it's fun. And I don't care if the grammar is good. I don't care if you know how to spell. I want you to want to write by the end of this, and we'll figure out all the technical stuff later. And at the beginning of the class, nobody wanted to be there. Okay, mom's making me take this writing class. And by the time we were halfway through, I had kids who were running into the classroom at the start of class. They're like, Hannah, here's this story that I wrote over the week. Will you read it? And it was okay, they've discovered that this is fun. And I've sort of rekindled this love of playing with words and ideas. So I was very confident going into the after school program where I was doing a very similar thing. There was a writing contest that the program wanted some of their students to submit to. And so the idea was like we were going to get together once or twice a week and work on their writing. At the end, they'll have a story to submit. And I was working with 3 different age groups, 1st through 3rd, 4th through 6th, and basically like middle and high school. The little kids were so much fun. I was just like, we're going to write stories. And they were like, okay.
Yeah.
And it was just like a trip. Like I'd come in and like we'd brainstorm ideas together and I'd show them how to like lay everything out and like get their, you know, they all would put pen to paper. They all had fun. The 4th and 6th graders I had to work with more to get them excited. I was like, we're going to write stories. And they were like, do we have to? And I was like, it'll be fun. And they're like, are you sure? And I'm like, just like, trust me. Like, let's try it. If you hate it, we'll like come up with something else.
Yeah.
And they did write, but it took a lot more effort to get them hyped up for it every week. The middle and high schoolers just like sat there and looked at me. Like literally they would just be like this. I would be explaining to them like, okay, we're going to write something and submit it to the—
Our souls have already been crushed.
Yeah, we're going to submit it to this contest. There's like a cash prize. And they were just like— And I like had to sit down next to each one of them and like engage them one-on-one and be like, do you want to write a story? And they'd be like, nah. And I'd be like, do you have an idea? And they'd be like, ugh. And it was so, like, that was such a pivotal moment for me because like I was like running an after school writing program, right? Like it wasn't like a real class or anything. Like I was in the early stages of learning about education. But it was like a cool thing to do. Like I like to write. I thought maybe I could be helpful. And I went to the person who ran the after school program and I was like, I'm so sorry. Like I'm failing. Like the kids won't write. I'm so like, you don't have to pay me. Like I'm so sorry. And she was like, honestly, like you're doing better than most of the people we have come in here. Like they're actually like talking to you. And I was like, what are you talking about?
I know,
but
it's so terrible.
Anything that felt like education to them, they were allergic to it. So like it felt like school, so they didn't want to do it, even though we were writing stories and it wasn't like school at all. Like,
and they weren't going to get a grade, like
yeah,
in a way that
it was like they were submitting it, like they could win money if they wanted to, but like, you know, they didn't have to, but they wouldn't, like, you could see we sat down and just like their desire to engage at all, like their will to be alive, just like, they were just like, we're just here. So, and that was so enlightening to me. I was like, wow, this really does— school kills it. Like it was like seeing like the cross section, you know, like when geologists will like cut into the rock and it's like, here's all the different layers of like all the different eras. I was like, wow, I'm looking at the cross section of just like what school does to you on a grade by grade basis. And it was horrifying.
Isn't that just teenagers? And they're just like teenage life is, well, first of all, middle school sucks and is terrible.
Yes.
And your body's changing. Is that a function of school? Or is that a function of, well, teenagers are just like that. They're a bunch of pains in the asses.
So my friend Matt Bateman, who is one of the founders of Higher Ground Montessori, it's the largest network of Montessori schools in the world. They're actually based here in Austin. Yeah. Austin really is a hot spot for the education movement. He's written quite a bit and given talks on this idea of normal as in common versus normal as in like healthy. Right. And he talks about this in the context of childhood development, from early childhood all the way through adolescence. And he looks at this through the lens of Montessori because he's a philosopher who is building Montessori schools. So that's the, you know, pedagogical approach that he applies to the schools that he's building and the way he educates his own kids. But he makes this distinction between normal behaviors that are common versus normal behaviors that are healthy. And he uses the example of like smoker's lungs. Like if everyone in the society smokes, it's normal to have poorly functioning lungs as in common, but it's not normal as in healthy. That's not a normal lung in like a biological sense. Yeah. And he applies that same thing to the way that we think about the stages of childhood development. And I think he makes a really astute point, and I think that's a really good distinction, because just because all the teenagers you know are moody and disrespectful and apathetic does not mean that that's like a normal developmental stage. When you are a teenager, you're at a developmental stage where you just came out of elementary school and early middle school, where you were learning how to formulate complex ideas for yourself for the first time. Like you've attained the cognitive capacity to synthesize complicated ideas and have interests and go chase those interests and like really pursue them to an end of your own design. When you're reaching adolescence, you're at a developmental stage where you're ready to go out into the world and test yourself against the world. Like, you're developmentally ready to have your first job. You're developmentally ready to have a social network that doesn't hinge on your parents or your teachers anymore. Like, you're independently going out into the world and meeting people and testing yourself socially. Like, you want to see, how do I stack up, and like, how do I fit in, and how do I navigate complex social situations, and like, what am I capable of?
Identity formation seems to be a big part of this adolescent time too.
Identity formation and like testing your own capacities. Adolescents, normal as in healthy, are excited about building something of themselves, whether it's working their first job, whether it's working on a project, whether it's working on their social networking. They're like, yes, their hormones are off the charts, and yes, that's very difficult, but it doesn't have to be apathetic and miserable. I just finished running the inaugural cohort of a new writing fellowship at the Foundation for Economic Education that was designed to, it's called the Cole Summers Fellowship, named after a teenager who was unschooled, who wrote an autobiography about his experience. Like, incredible book, incredible kid. And we built this fellowship to help kids who are adolescents, teenagers, who are going through some type of alternative mode of education, whether it's a Montessori school. We had two students actually who went to Michael Strong's school in the first cohort.
Socratic experience.
Yep. A couple homeschoolers, a kid in India who dropped out of high school to go work at a startup run by Naval. Like, really cool cohort of kids. And the idea is like, we're helping them learn how to write about their experiences and then write about whatever else they want too. None of those kids are even remotely apathetic. They're 13 through 17, and they're like excited to engage you. They have projects they're working on. One of them's learning how to sell her artwork at farmers markets and craft markets. She's like actually a profitable artist at age 17. One of them super into like horseback riding and like really wanted to build a brand around talking about her equestrian endeavors. One of them's like interested in like software and programming. One of them's working full-time at a startup. Like, these kids are anything but like moody and apathetic, and they're coming from all different modalities of education, all different backgrounds. They're not even all from the same country. Like, it's a pretty broad sample size. It's not as simple as like just school did it, it's school's fault, but it's a hugely contributing factor.
How do you think about this phrase, falling behind?
Hate it.
So here we are in 2024. We have the first wave of college graduates who graduated from high school in the initial earliest peak of the COVID pandemic, which was in May of 2020. Like, peak lockdown. Oh, let's try full totalitarianism in America and see how that works time. So we now are told that, kids that got locked down, got the masking and all the nonsense that happened, are 2 to 3 years behind. But there's a broader sense in which I don't want my kid to fall behind that is not just about COVID, but about the entire process at every step. Like, are they on track? Are they falling behind? How do you think about that?
I think it's a really, really poisonous way of thinking about your child's education. I think it's the incentives all wrong, and I think a lot of the mile markers that we're worried about are arbitrary. When the public school curriculum was designed, it was, there were grade level standards that were set. They were highly standardized, and they were catering to the mean. So it's like, the average child in our classroom, what are they going to be ready to learn in second grade? And how much can the average kid get through in a grade level? Fun fact about public school, you only need 60 to 70% to get a passing grade. So like a C or a D, and it's like amazing. You're like ready to go to the next grade level. You're missing 30 to 40% of what you were supposed to learn in a given year, and yet you still move on to the next grade level. So you can be in a math class learning long division and only understand 60 to 70% of how long division works, but you got a passing grade, so you move on to the next grade level, and now you're studying fractions or like getting ready for pre-algebra, and you don't understand how to do fractions because you don't understand how to do long division, even though you passed. And so kids are going through grade level after grade level with huge holes in their knowledge. And if you've ever watched a skyscraper being built, if you're in Austin, you see a lot of this happening right now.
I was noticing driving down the street last night to go to have dinner with a friend. I was like, oh my God, there's like 5 skyscrapers with cranes in the air over the city right now.
It is a wild time to be in Austin, but that is a separate conversation. They're very meticulous about making sure each level is completed and all the structural components are in place before they move on to the next level. If they were skipping beams and they're like, well, we got 70% of the support structures on floor 3, so we can just like keep going. By the time you got to like floor 8, the whole thing would be falling apart because it couldn't sustain the weight of what was put on top of it. And yet we're taking that exact approach in the education system. It's like, well, they're good enough, so we're going to move them on to the next level. And so kids are struggling in algebra because they never properly learned multiplication and fractions, and yet they passed. And so falling behind is already extraordinarily arbitrary because like kids are doing it all the time and it's getting swept under the rug because like the system classifies them as having passed and moving on to the next grade, even if they're really not ready to. So in a sense, everybody's already fallen behind, even though they're like sort of keeping up. But at the same time, the standards of when kids are supposed to learn what are very, very arbitrary. There's a huge debate in alternative education around when children should learn to read. Waldorf basically like has banned learning how to read until you're 7. It's like, no, you're not, don't touch reading. It's like going to hurt you somehow if you don't do it until you're like 7. Montessori is teaching kids how to trace sandpaper letters at like 3. So there's this huge discrepancy across different modalities of like when the right time is. And I think my opinion is that nobody could agree because there isn't actually one answer. I think that's like most of the problems in how we educate kids comes back to that again and again. Like education in our country is so broken because we tried to fit every unique child into one standardized model, and that just doesn't work. Public school actually, like some kids come through the public school system and have amazing outcomes. Like it does work for some kids, but it does not work for everyone. And we've been pretending like it does at the expense of many, many, many children's potential. Some kids naturally pick up a book and spontaneously start reading when they're 5 years old, and their parents are just like, what happened? And they're like, I don't know. Like I watched you read to me every night and now I just like figured it out. And other kids are 8 years old and refuse to learn how to read, much to the chagrin of their parents. There have been numerous studies that have been done that show that like whether a child learns to read at 4 or learns to read at 8 does not actually impact their long-term literacy. Like a child can catch up very quickly, which is one of the things I also say to homeschooling parents who are very worried about getting something wrong, or aspiring homeschool parents who are very afraid of missing something. If your child doesn't get everything that they were supposed to get in their 2nd grade year, if they're in a system that is adaptable and can catch the things later that have been missed and fill in the gaps, they can learn all of that later. Like if your kid doesn't want to learn how to read until they're 9, you're not dooming them to long-term life failure. They'll probably learn how to read very quickly because they're at a developmental stage where it's just much faster to absorb the information than it was when they were 4. And they'll pick it up very quickly. And cognitively, they can process the actual words and meaning, so they'll be able to read at grade level very quickly. And they'll be able to fill in the gaps later of anything that they missed. And I think parents get very, very afraid when they deviate outside of the system of their kid falling behind or getting something wrong. And I think one of the most important things is that you can always fill in the gaps later, especially if you've taught your child the art of learning, which school does not teach. It teaches the art of memorization, of rule following, of repetition and regurgitation of what someone else has said to you. It does not teach you how to say, I don't know this. I need to go learn this. I need to figure it out. And kids who are educated in most other modalities that are not like traditional education or institutional education learn that very quickly. And once they have that meta skill, they can learn anything. So anything that's like fallen behind, they can pick it up later, probably better and faster than they ever would in a classroom anyway. And they would have reinforced the meta skill of learning something, which is a lifelong skill that you need. And you mentioned earlier, you hire people based on, you know, their ability to demonstrate the character traits that you care about. And at the bottom of the list, you're like, here are some skills that we want you to either have or learn once you're on the job. You're hiring people who can learn things. Like, you don't need them to know everything from the onset.
I mean, I've worked for a long time because I worked in school. My son has actually had jobs since 7th grade because Acton encouraged internships. And his senior year at San Juan Diego here in Austin, 1 day a week, they go work at a real job. So he actually worked at Dell Seton Hospital, 1 day a week. Doing
what?
Checking to see if drugs are expired. It was like really mundane stuff, right? But what he really learned was, I've got to show up. I've got to be able to interact with people in a busy environment. I have to remember the set of things I have to do and self-manage myself and get to the end. I think this is true for just about every kind of job. Every employer wants to hire someone that will figure it out for themselves. Because it's so expensive to have to didactically tell someone exactly how to do the job. If I have to tell you how to do the job, I'm doing your job for you, which means why did I hire you in the first place? Because I don't need a robot. I need you to be a person that figures things out. And it just reminds me of so many instances like this, where there's this like deep misunderstanding about what the most useful thing would be. Like one other example, when I was in middle school, high school, it was the time where like Apple computer, my beloved Apple computer, was on the downturn. And there was this big move to replace Macintoshes with PCs, with Windows PCs. And the claim was, the kids should work on a Windows PC because when they come out into the working world, they're going to work on a Windows PC. It's like, well, okay, so if you were working on like Windows 3.1 in high school, by the time you've gotten out of college, Windows doesn't look anything like Windows did 5 years ago. So what do you think you're teaching them? Like where the menu bars are? Like the kind of prescriptiveness misses even at the most basic level. It's like that is not the part that will be useful at all. Like that's not going to be useful. Like, and we all know it's not going to be useful. And I'm diatribing here a little bit, but one big piece of it to me, and we all experience this as adults, is no matter how good you are at your craft, you take on a new job or you start a new thing and you have no idea what you're doing. And it's called learning on the job. And everyone I've ever met, even doctors, say, oh yeah, you basically learn everything about the job on the job. Whatever you did before is this like prerequisite set of skills, and a lot of it can apply, but it's always like a majority of the work in the new job you have to learn on the job. Why do you think it is that we all experience this throughout our entire adult lives, and then we think about what our kids are going to do, and we put them into this system that looks nothing like that and doesn't prepare them for that? Like objectively, it doesn't, like no part of this, like I'm not in a work environment with everyone that has a similar birthday. Like, what does that have to do with anything? That we're all of a similar age? Mm-hmm. Like, so that's weird. Why am I being forced to try to learn things in 45-minute increments with radical mode shifts between them? That's awful. All of us know how much that sucks on a daily basis, to mode shift radically. I'm in English class, bell rings, run with my books to math class, completely different modality, and I'm supposed to be productive here. And it's 15 minutes and I'm finally into the math mode, and like the class is almost over already. This all seems like normal, reasonable, like obviously this is stupid, and yet we're the crazy ones. Because most still right now, like 85% of kids are going through it that way. And even it's probably more than that, because again, like Catholic, a lot of schools, even when they're private, still basically look like this. Are we crazy? Are we just getting it wrong? Are we just out on the fringe and we're subject to our own biases? And hey, the world keeps moving on and these kids are going through the school system and everything kind of sucks. So are we wrong?
Well, it's like the movie The Matrix, which everybody references, but it's a good metaphor. If you're in it, you can't see it for what it is. Something has to snap you out to be able to see that maybe it doesn't have to be this way. Maybe it doesn't make sense. Like, you can't see the forest for the trees when you're in it. And so if everyone you've ever known has gone through the system and that's just how you prepare yourself to be ready for adulthood and careers, then it makes sense. And when it's, it's taxpayer funded and it's expert endorsed, and, all of the great thinkers of our time went through either public school or a private school that's built on almost exactly the same model. Because to your point, most private schools are running the exact same institutional model of education. It's the same thing. Yeah. There's like institutional education, and then there's self-directed education, which is the place where people are innovating. It's what I believe is the future of education. It's some of these examples that I've referenced over the course of our conversation are modalities of self-directed education.
It's also the whole how you will learn for the rest of your natural life after you get out of school.
Exactly. There's also, yes, that is self-directed education. You'd think we would be preparing our children for it in K-12, but no. It's grandfathered in. It's what we know. It appears to be the through line between childhood and adult success as you go through this education system, because everyone did it. And that's just a really hard spell to break. It's scary to do something else. There's this weird sort of phenomenon where people are more afraid of succeeding doing something different than failing doing something that's normal. Think about it. Like, it is scarier to send your child to an acting academy and have to explain to your entire family and friend network for the entirety of their school career, like, Bobby's doing great in school. He's getting great grades, or like not grades because he's in this school that doesn't have grades. Like, but he's succeeding, I promise. That's a scary thing to have to report back on. If that same child is in public school and isn't doing well, that's not your fault because you did the right things. You put them in the institution that is acceptable. If the system is spitting out kids who are not achieving the outcomes that they were promised or they thought the system delivered, that they had the potential to reach, at least they all did it together. That's still less scary than being somebody who didn't go to real school, didn't go to college, has to explain themselves in every room. I actually don't have to explain myself in a room. No one cares anymore. I've just made it my thing to talk about it because I think it's important.
I haven't been asked about where I studied. After my first job, that was the end of that. I got out of school. I went and got my first job. My next job was based on the work of my first job. And that was the end of that. That was the end of it. And it's every single adult I know that has been their experience.
Yeah, so nobody cares. But if you'd gone through some alternative modality and then you weren't successful, well, your parents just made a terrible decision and it's all their fault. It's scary to fail, but it's also scary to succeed because you still, everybody's always Bobby didn't go to real school. I don't know what to tell you. And that stigma is really hard to break.
I want to change gears and dive in as rapid a fire way as our long form conversations can go through the different options that we face as parents.
Amazing.
So if you're still with us and you don't think we're lunatics and you're thinking, yeah, oh God, oh, the scales have fallen from my eyes and now I'm in the darkness. I thought I was in the light and now I realize I'm in a dark room.
You're not. We'll light a candle in a moment. You're going to be fine.
Let's chart some paths. So there's a bunch of different types of schools to choose from, including homeschooling, which in and of itself is really just what kind of you're going to learn at home, but the way you'll learn at home will vary probably. So walk me through the options as you understand them, pros and cons, or fit, not fit.
Homeschooling is basically you pull your child out of the public school or never enroll them in the first place. And instead of enrolling them at a different school, you educate them yourself. Huge historical precedent. It's how we raised our children for centuries. Little House on the Prairie, Laura Ingalls Wilder, homeschooler. There's a whole spectrum of how you can homeschool your kids. Anything from basically recreating what's happening inside of public school, but at home with, we studied math at 9 o'clock and English at 10, all the way through to unschooling, which is like legally you're a homeschooler. You do whatever you have to do with the state to file as a homeschooler, but you don't have any school structure at all. Your kids basically can do whatever they want all day. They're completely in charge of their education from like kindergarten on.
So Sudbury at home.
Yeah, which sounds is a democracy of one, which sounds frightening, but we can get into unschooling later if we want to. The outcomes are actually like really, really impressive. Kids are capable of a lot more than you think. But basically, you're doing school at home, and there are as many ways of doing it as there are families homeschooling. Like, it's really a make it your own. You can purchase a curriculum if you want to have some structure for you to follow as a parent, but you absolutely don't have to. I'm generally not a huge advocate of doing it the curriculum way. Like, if that's what makes you happy and makes you feel comfortable, like, go for it. There's nothing wrong with it, but you don't have to. I don't feel like you have to feel beholden to following someone else's system in order to be doing it right. I do think that if you're replicating the school model while homeschooling, you're missing out on all of the potential. Like, you're not just getting rid of the building, you should be getting rid of the educational philosophy too. Homeschoolers often finish their school day in like a couple hours a day when you're not beholden on to waiting for everyone else and having your time artificially segmented. You can move through your work very quickly, and then homeschoolers can spend the rest of the day doing the things that they're biologically hardwired to do, like play and exercise and be outside and build things.
Before we were recording, we talked about the fact that, again, I think from a studies perspective, which again, like social science studies, I always feel like I have to do this. 'Cause do they replicate? What's the sample size? How did you, cause versus effect? How did you do that? But my understanding is that every attempt to study models of education have basically arrived at the same thing for like 50 years, which is one-on-one instruction, which also used to be called apprenticeship in the before times, is the best.
It is.
So isn't that homeschooling?
That is. Well, I mean, you might have multiple kids and then you're kind of replicating the one-room classroom model. But yes.
But 1 on 2, 3, 4, 5 is still a lot closer to 1-on-1 than 1 on 30.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's replicating that. And it's also, I talk to a lot of parents who are homeschoolers or aspiring homeschoolers, and they're always, they're like, well, I don't know if I'm qualified to teach my kid math. Like, I was never good at math in school. Or like, I don't feel qualified to teach them history. Like, I don't know if I'm teaching them the right thing. You don't have to design a curriculum as a homeschool parent. You don't have to be an expert at everything. This is one of my hotter takes, but education as we know it died and became completely obsolete the moment the internet went online. Like, it was the death sentence of education as we know it, institutional education, because information went online and people have done amazing work designing incredible education resources. There's like Khan Academy will teach your kid everything they could ever need to know in math for free, K through 12, all the like fun math electives they could ever want to take. You can get it all for free on the internet. You don't have to understand math to support your kid getting a phenomenal math education that honestly is probably way better than anything they would get in the classroom at their local school. There are great learning apps that we've created roundups of them at Renegade Educator. If you're curious, there's tons of stuff out there to teach your kid language arts, foreign languages, history, whatever your kid could want to learn. You don't have to know all the things to teach your kid. You're just the facilitator who's making sure they have the right resources.
I don't think most K through 12 educators have a degree or have an area of expertise in the particular subject they're teaching. Like, this isn't Finland, and which is, as I understand it, the Finnish school system is often touted by statist educator people. Oh, this is so great. They pay the teachers so much money. It's unified. They've basically crushed all alternatives. It's the perfect kind of utopian totalitarian system. And if there's one thing I would take out of the Finnish model that was probably better than what we do, as I understand it, is actually your math teacher has a math degree, which is like why you can pay them $100,000 instead of have a degree in education, which appears to be kind of worthless. Right? Am I misinformed on that front, that like most K through 12 aren't specialized? Like, the history teacher didn't necessarily study history.
Everybody says that you need to have a teaching degree in order to understand how to teach children. Teachers love to yell at me on Twitter about this and Instagram, wherever they find me. They get very mad about this.
Yeah. Good old appeal to authority, logical fallacy.
You are not qualified to educate your children at home because you haven't learned how to educate, which if you read a bunch of books about education, like you're gonna be a subject matter expert, I promise. When teachers are in school to learn how to be teachers or in college, they have to do student teaching. They do the student teaching before they get to the part where they're learning how to teach in a classroom. They're doing the student teaching first and then they're learning how to do it. So like they're not even following their own like logic of like you have to be educated in this before you can do it.
Maybe they're just screwing over those students and that's just part of the weird higher ed, which is like a hedge fund that pretends to be a school of learning scam.
We can talk all day about, I mean, I know we're going through a list of like different modalities. Like we can talk all day about what the ideal systems of education, I say plural because I don't think there's just one, but like what ideal models might look like. One of the things I get really excited about is people who actually do have subject matter expertise teaching classes. I mean, this is what, if you have tons of money and you're hiring tutors, you're going to hire, like if you're a billionaire, you're going to hire like the best Harvard professors to teach your kids, like people who are actually doing in the field research on topics, you're going to hire them to one-on-one tutor your kids to teach them, you know, fractions or whatever. That's not scalable. You can't have, there is not a mathematician surplus to an extent where you could hire a mathematician to one-on-one tutor every child who's learning mathematics. But that's why the internet is so incredible, is because you can have a subject matter expert who's like really passionate about education.
And a good communicator.
Yeah, and who can go create amazing resources that are free on the internet that's infinitely scalable. Every child in the world can watch them. It's not like we run out of clicks, like only so many people can watch this YouTube video before it like expires. Like everybody can watch it, everybody can learn from it. And then you have AI, which is replicating some of what a one-on-one teacher has to do in the classroom. So you mentioned, like, you know, for 50 years we've been studying education, and one of the biggest things we've learned is that kids learn best from a one-on-one tutoring. We've done decades of research into what's called learning science. So it's the science of how we learn. And we've learned a lot of really meaningful things. There's a Bloom's Two Sigma study is often referenced. It was in the early 80s. It was a study by Benjamin Bloom, who was researching how kids learn. And he found that when you have kids getting one-on-one tutoring, employing other learning science methodologies like spaced repetition, which is where, you know, you learn something and then there's a gap where you don't have to remember it, and then you practice forced recall or active recall, where you go back, you try to remember what you'd learned after this, like, you know, gap has elapsed. You are going to start to cement the information in your mind because your mind has been forced to recall it, which reinforces the neural pathways for that information. You practice active recall where you learn something. Duolingo is actually a great example of this. They do a great job implementing learning science. So you take this like 10-minute lesson where you click through a bunch of words, and then at the end there's a little quiz. And you have to recall what you just learned. And they grade the quiz and they're like, all right, you got like 7 out of 10 things right. And now we're going to auto-generate the next lesson where you are able to basically just drill the things that you didn't get right the first time. And we're going to keep doing that until you got everything right. And then we'll introduce the next concept.
So you mean like actual mastery of the subject prior to moving on and being like, well, I only got 70% of math, but now on to the next thing.
It's called mastery-based learning. Exactly. Yeah. Bloom's Two Sigma study found that children learn 2 standard deviations faster when all of these things are being applied in a one-on-one tutoring context. You can't replicate that in a classroom because a teacher cannot take 30 quizzes and then deliver 30 different lessons depending on how every kid scored on the quiz. It's just not possible. But AI can replicate this infinitely. So you can have teachers who are actual subject matter experts teaching kids things, and then AI tools that are allowing kids to practice this and get infinitely iterating, infinitely scalable, infinitely customizable, and totally unique lessons based on exactly where they are. and actually master a subject before they move on to the next thing. So and all of these tools, like a lot of them already exist. So like if a parent wants to homeschool, they can just like plug into all of this infrastructure that already exists on the internet. And a lot of, we'll get into private school models in a minute, but a lot of them are using this technology tool too. It's very exciting.
Okay, so that's homeschooling. I mean, it's not all of homeschooling, but it's a good little taste of the reality of homeschooling. Mm-hmm. Catholic school. What's your thoughts? So, I think I had Wilfred Riley on the show, and he basically said, in his dry, flippant way, like, "Oh, you want to send your kids to a good school, and the public school's probably garbage. There's a good Catholic school in your neighborhood, most likely. Just send them to that. They're going to do better. Done deal." I went to 12 years of Catholic school, so. What's your thoughts on Catholic school as an alternative option for parents? Catholic or not?
I think most private schools, most Catholic schools, most Christian schools, they're all running a very similar model to what's happening in the public school. They have obviously different ideology, different moral compass. They have a different value set that they're structuring the education around. But the actual mechanics of education are very similar. It's going to be higher quality because it's not a government institution. It's a private organization.
They can go out of business if they suck.
Exactly.
They don't get to steal their revenue to keep them alive.
The free market principle of having to be good at what you do in order to survive actually applies. But also, like, people are involved they actually care about the outcomes. And so it's going to be a higher quality education. But it's still a very similar model in terms of academic structure to what's being run in the public schools. It's still a very similar Prussian originated, very top-down authoritarian model of education. It doesn't fall in the self-directed education bucket. A lot of people have great outcomes in Catholic schools. It's definitely a better alternative to public school in, like, academically in many contexts.
Yeah.
But it's not a self-directed education. I wouldn't put it in like the innovative bucket.
Part of the reason why we went through multiple radical alternative routes was because I saw in kindergarten that the Catholic school, this was in New Jersey at the time that my son was in, was already being super rigorous, and like he hated it, and it was terrible. And I talked to the principal, and she said we have to keep up with the public schools standards because the parents ask this of us. Mm-hmm. So I kind of saw that, I don't think this is going to work the way I want it to work, even though I would like my son to, have his faith be part of his schooling. And I do think they care more about the kids. I believe that. I think that is absolutely the case. Like, if you go to a Catholic school, you are going to get a better education, and it's not going to be that expensive, all things considered. The diocese helps subsidize it. They often are placed in neighborhoods intentionally that are for underprivileged and urban environments where, for me, like my school was a couple blocks away from the prison in downtown Allentown, and they were like, my dad wanted them. He was like, "I'll give you half my salary if you'll move the damn school away from the prison." And they were like, "No, we're here to serve the poor in the community." So I do think Catholic school is a better choice if that's the best choice you've got relative to just the government school, and if you can't homeschool for one reason or another. That's my own take. But I agree with you. It's not that different in terms of the experience of it. Yeah,
the academic structure is very similar. One of the distinctions that I make that I think is helpful to kind of think through is you can have a schooling model that is system-centric. You can have a model that's teacher-centric. You can have one that's parent-centric, or you can have one that truly is student-centric. That's like everything is built around what's best for the child.
Yeah.
Which is very hard to do at an institutional level. Public school is almost completely system-centric. It's all designed around what makes a sustainable system, which is, fair thing to be trying to solve for if you're trying to build an education system that spans an entire continent. Do I think that's a good thing to be trying to do in the first place? No, but like it makes sense. Many private schools are still very teacher and parent centric. They're building an education around what's best for the teacher inside of the classroom and what's best for the parent, like what the parent wants, not what the child wants. And the modalities that I get most excited about are the ones that are truly student centric, where if a child doesn't want to do something, they don't have to. and where the child's interests are the driving compass, even when it's inconvenient for the teacher or frustrating to the parent.
As we move progressively more progressive, let's say.
The one place where that's actually like maybe a good word.
So that would bring me to the next modality, which I've experienced with our son because I've tried almost all of them, and that's Montessori. Good old Maria Montessori, you know, more student directed. For the viewer that's not familiar, what is Montessori? What's your take on it?
I love Montessori. Maria Montessori was a 20th century educator. Actually, she was a physician first and then an educator. She built her first schools in the slums of Italy. She was working at first with children who had disabilities and then later expanded her pedagogy out to, you know, children in general and their developmental needs. She is one of the deepest thinkers of education of the 20th century that I have found. She had an approach that was extremely rooted in developmental psychology and extremely rooted in building confidence and self-direction in her students. So she believed very heavily in the capabilities of children from an early age and their ability to do focused and self-directed work. So a Montessori classroom, Montessori education actually starts from like 3 to 6 months of age, depending on the school. There are Montessori daycares where the pedagogy is already in place, even with infants and little babies. They have, like you see when you walk into like a Montessori daycare, instead of having cribs, as long as zoning allows for it, they have floor beds. So they're just like thin mattresses on the floor. The children can crawl on and off by themselves. They don't require adults to lift them up into the crib and take them back down again. An adult is not the custodian of their freedom. And so the child is able to be very self-directed and self-deterministic from a very early age. When you walk into a Montessori classroom, even with like 3 and 4 year olds, you'll often see them doing what's called a work cycle. So Montessori classrooms are all child-sized. Everything in it is at the height and size of the students. The classrooms, like all the furnitures, get progressively bigger as you go up through the ages. But it's not, there's nothing in the room. There might be one chair that's adult-sized for a visitor to sit in and observe. Everything else is child-sized. And there are lots of materials that are just out on the shelves that are in plain view, and the children can go and they can take a material down and they can work with it. And there are all of these different, it's like sort of a play-based learning model where there are all of these different tools that a child can use, or like that an adult might just think is a toy, but that's teaching them something. There are blocks that are all mathematically proportional, and kids use them to start to understand the principles of, you know, they're 4 years old and they're learning how to like stack all of these blocks to make them all fit in a box. And when they're in 8th grade, they'll draw the through line between that and understanding algebra. They learn to read at a very early age, mostly self-directed. They have what they call guides in a classroom. They don't have teachers. And those guides are, you know, helping the kids learn how to use the materials and helping give them lessons. But for the most part, children do work cycles, which are like 90 minutes to 2 hours, completely independently, where they choose what they want to work on. They work on it. They put it away again. You walk into a Montessori classroom, you see like a 2-year-old cutting up their own banana to make a snack. Like, it's crazy. Montessori is a great pedagogy. It mostly is focused on smaller kids. Like, really, Maria Montessori's work was from like 0 to 6 years old. She had some writings on older kids, but not a lot. But there are some organizations, particularly Guidepost Montessori or Higher Ground Montessori, that draws it all the way out to high school. They have Montessori high schools, which is super cool.
My son actually was in Montessori preschool, which was actually kind of just an accident of the neighborhood. And it was great, which actually meant, which was actually one of the reasons why when he went into the local Catholic kindergarten and it was all rigid and structured and like teacher-centric, was so jarring. And so when we came down to Austin, he started off in Austin Waldorf school, but then for 4th and 5th, he was at the Montessori that initially Kyoto Cabelli and Michael Strong started. It was called Cabelli Montessori. And then I was sort of I was saddened to realize that most Montessoris stop before middle school. And that was why we ultimately that was one of the reasons we put him in Acton, because Acton, like, I didn't realize Higher Ground actually goes into middle school and high school.
Yeah,
that's
great. They have I want to say 5 in person around the country. They're working, it's a newer project, so they're working on expanding, but there is one here in Austin. And I believe they're also developing a virtual school, so it's accessible to kids anywhere, even if you can't be in person at one of their high schools. But I do think people get really excited about the Montessori middle and high school thing because they love it for earlier ages. So I think it's a thing that's going to expand, and Higher Ground's done a really great job, like doing the years of philosophical work to really break down like what are the through lines between what you're doing at age 6 and what you should be doing at like 16.
You know, how accessible, do you know how accessible Montessori is for people around the country? Because the more you get into the more radical things like Acton and Alpha and Sudbury for sure, the fewer there are. So how many, if I throw a dart at the continental US, sorry, Alaska and Hawaii, how close am I to a Montessori school?
If you're in a rural area, you're going to be pretty far from pretty much anything. If you're in any moderately suburban or urban area, it's fairly likely that there's going to be a Montessori school. It's become fairly ubiquitous, and it's a movement that's growing pretty rapidly. So I anticipate that's going to change over the next decade. I think it's going to become even more common. But I talk to people all the time who are from, I don't know, like not a small town, but not a big city either. Yeah. They're like, oh yeah, like my cousin's kid goes to like a Montessori daycare or whatever. It's become fairly common. It's not all created equal. There are certification programs and training programs that people go through to become a Montessori guide or a Montessori head of school, but there's no like centralized sort of standardization board that's dictating like, okay, you are doing Montessori correctly and you can keep calling it a Montessori school. So there's a lot of variance in quality that parents need to be aware of, but it's become pretty common, which is very exciting.
So staying on the track towards more and more student direction, what would be next after Montessori for you?
I'm going to go with the thread of guides, as Montessori calls their teachers, because there are a lot of other models that have embraced the Montessori idea that we don't have a teacher in the classroom, a sage on the stage. Like we said, we have a guide who's there to facilitate, to support, to coach, but not to teach. And there are a lot of models that have embraced that philosophy. Acton Academy, which we've mentioned a few times, is one of the leading examples. They have locations all around the world, and their model is very, very self-directed. Students choose what they want to work on. They choose how long they want to work on it for. They choose what completion looks like. They have a guide who's there to support them and make sure that they have all the resources that they need, that they're being challenged and coached appropriately, but not telling them what to do. And there are a lot of other models that are similar to that or explicit spin-offs of that. There's Alpha School here in Austin, which we mentioned earlier. There's a school in North Austin, Cedar Park, called Apogee that was founded by Tim Kennedy, who's best known for being a special forces person and a former MMA fighter. But he built an Acton Academy, found that too constrictive for what he wanted to do, broke off of Acton Academy, rebranded as Apogee. This was about 2 years ago, and he's in the process of launching 50 new schools around the country in September of 2024, which is crazy, crazy aggressive growth. But that's another one where it's a different set of values. It's a different, they wanted to do something a little bit different. So it's very family focused, very community oriented. The parents get a reading list too at Apogee.
It's a good reading list. I've looked at the website.
But
You'll be like, oh, why didn't I read all these? Did I read these books? I feel like I should have read these books.
Yeah, they're not wrong. But again, they're taking this approach of like a guide is the teacher's or the child's facilitator in the classroom. There are other models that are very like project-based schools, and some of them are virtual, which we haven't talked about really yet. Like we talked about free resources on the internet, but we haven't talked about virtual schools. The virtual schooling movement's very exciting because it gives kids access to things all over the world.
Well, we've had Michael Strong on, who we've talked about in passing a little bit here, and he's got his Socratic experience, which is a virtual school, and it's modeled on these self-directed and Socratic guide-based principles.
Yeah,
so that's one of many, I think.
Yeah, there are a few others. Like I mentioned, like some of these schools, like Guidepost, which is the actual name of the schools that Higher Ground runs, they have virtual schools too. So if you're not close to one of their classrooms, your child can still be enrolled. There are online project-based schools. There's a great one called Sora School. That's a middle and high school that's all project-based. Kids are building things and doing things, and they're in like a virtual classroom where they're interacting with their friends online all day, but they're not like they can be, you mean like the rural desert of Utah, and you can still go to the school with a kid in like Manhattan. It's very cool. There's this movement called world schooling that has like a couple of different connotations. Like it can be like a nomadic family who's taking their kids around the world, and that's like a core part of their education.
It's not a bad part of the education.
It really isn't. But there's a school called Kubrio that bills itself as a world school, and they have all of these virtual classes that kids can take, but they divide it into time zone regions, and there's 3. So there's like North and South America, there's Europe and Africa, and then there's like Asian and Pacific. And you're probably going to take classes in your time zone, but you don't have to. Like you could stay up really late in Europe to take classes with the kids in America and like learn alongside kids from all over the world and just like make that a part of your education. So there are interesting models like that are also emerging. There's also like supplemental things like Synthesis, which is a game-based program. It's not a full-on school. But have you met Chrisman Frank, the co-founder? He's amazing.
No.
You'd really like him.
We should have him on the show.
You would really like him. But he Synthesis was like a part of Elon Musk started a school for his kids.
I was going to ask you about, wasn't there like a SpaceX school?
Yes. Yeah. So
that's Synthesis.
So Synthesis is like the child of the SpaceX school. So Elon Musk started a school for his kids, and some of the SpaceX engineer kids, like it was very competitive. There were 30 spots in the school. There were a lot more than 30 children of SpaceX engineers. It was competitive to get into, but it was based in LA, and they hired this guy named Josh Don to help build the school. Like he was the head of school. He was designing everything. And one of the things he built was this game called Synthesis that was supposed to help kids practice problem solving and critical thinking and teamwork in real time. The kids loved it. And when the SpaceX school closed during COVID and Elon's kids graduated, so like it was time to move on, he and his co-founder, Chrisman Frank, turned Synthesis into a virtual program where kids play these games that they've developed and learn problem solving, thinking on the fly, collaborating with a team to solve a problem. Kids love it. They've had wait lists for quite some time, I believe, to get into the games. So that's another model where it's like, it's not even like a full-time school, but it's such an awesome like resource that kids can integrate into their education. I think we're going to see more and more of that type of thing emerge.
We're so fortunate to be here because like we've been, yes, we're physically in Austin together and we live here, and but there really is a lot of different school options in Austin in a way that's almost unlike any other place that I've encountered. Even in like the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area, it was like, I mean, we've got like everything you could possibly imagine, including like things that sound like subtle variations on the same super radical thing, like apogee, actin, alpha. To the uninitiated, all sound similar and similarly crazy. Like, oh no, you can't ask. The guides don't answer questions, kind of stuff. What's your take on Waldorf? So, a deep breath. So when we came down, we surveyed a bunch of options. Mm-hmm. We had this feeling that, okay, the traditional Catholic maybe isn't the way we want to go right now. Although we looked at some of the Catholic schools, we strongly considered Montessori. Mm-hmm. We went for Waldorf. And the reason, from my perspective, and from both there's a couple things. One, the no media policy, which is a hallmark of it. Like you agree as a family to not have any kind of media, including recorded music, which if you really want to go like hardcore, you go all the way to no recorded music. It's like we're playing the instruments and talking about gnomes, and that's that. It's a lot of gnomes and magical fairy things in Waldorf, and everyone jokes about it. Our experience of Waldorf in early grades was pretty great. Mm-hmm. So what's your take? I'm sensing it's not great.
No, actually, that's I actually have positive things to say about Waldorf. I'm just laughing because it's relatable. I had a very Waldorf-inspired elementary education. My mom, before she realized that she could like design her own curriculum, bought Waldorf curricula.
Oh, okay.
We would go to the Waldorf school store. I think if I didn't grow up an hour away from the closest Waldorf school, I think my mom would have sent me to one. But it was just that's not a daily commute. You can't drop your kid off an hour away and then come and pick them up again.
That's horrible. Did you have any gnomes or any other?
Yeah, so that's why I was laughing. We had this really cool book. It was so cool. I think it was just called Gnomes. It was like huge. And it was like, I don't know if this is a Waldorf school staple or if this was something my mom found elsewhere, but it was this giant book. It was all hand illustrated. And it was like an encyclopedia of the gnomes. So it was like, there were pages and pages of like diagrams of like, this is what their houses look like under the trees. And this is like how one is normally laid out. And here's how their toilets function. And like, here's like how their kitchens are designed. And here's what they eat. And here's what they wear. And here's how they make their clothes. And this is like, these are the gnome holidays and the gnome culture. I spent hours.
All made up, by the way, guys.
Hours poring over that book.
No.
I had a very artistic childhood because of the Waldorf influence. And I had a very whimsical childhood. My mom loosely followed the Waldorf school curriculum, so we definitely we didn't have the no media policy. Although I did have a lot less media than even kids of the time had, and I was growing up in the early 2000s in elementary school, very different from the amount of media exposure that kids have now. We would do the lesson books where you'd have these beautiful books with nice paper and onion skin paper between the pages, and you'd write an essay and illustrate with beeswax crayons. Do an illustration for each essay. Like it was so beautiful, and I remember all the things that I learned about because I loved.
Did you have the beeswax crayons in a little roll-out knitted thing?
No, we didn't have that. We had them in the tin they came in, I think, and then eventually we just put them in a box because they were.
If you went to the Waldorf school, you would have knitted the thing that you'd put.
I did learn how to knit. We actually did take a knitting class at the Waldorf school. Some homeschool friends and I. That was really cool. But we go build gnome houses and fairy houses and knit little gnomes, and it actually was very whimsical and beautiful in that regard. So I have a very soft spot for it because I'm a very, very big proponent of whimsy in childhood. I think that imaginative play and that fantastical what if is so important for a kid's development. It's so beneficial. And Waldorf does such a great job delivering it.
It does.
I don't think that it's a great fit for every kid. I think some kids are going to thrive in it more than others. I don't think it's a great fit for every family. Different Waldorf schools have different policies around the media thing. Some of them allow computer usage outside of school. Some don't. You have to sign a contract where you're not going to use computers at all.
That was us.
You can kind of choose your school based on what feels like a fit for, really you're choosing based on what's local, but you have to choose what is and isn't a fit for your family.
My impression is it feels better suited to the younger end of the spectrum, which is part of why, that was one of the reasons why Mateo actually left after fourth grade. The other was you're moving with your class as a cohort.
Mm-hmm. And your teacher.
Which is
so cool.
That's the best part, in a way, because he had Betsy Cornelius, and first, second, third, fourth, the relationship that's developed there, it's not a one-to-one thing because there was 30 kids in the class, but as you're spending that much time, it comes closer to a one-to-one level of understanding.
Yeah.
And even if the curriculum milestones are the same for everybody, just that familiarity felt like a very substantial difference from typical teacher-led education to me.
Yeah, I really love that feature of it. There are some things about it that I don't fully agree with. I understand not pressuring kids to read before they're ready, and I agree with that very much. But if a child is ready, I don't think it makes sense to hold them back from reading. And that's one thing that I kind of differ with Waldorf on. They're much more concerned about kids reading too early, and I'm very in support of if a kid's curious about it at 4, let them read. This is one of the big places where Montessori and Waldorf really differ. I also have mixed feelings about completely closing kids off from technology. I think in some ways it's good. I'm very pro kids not being just completely steeped in pop culture. But I do think they're going to spend the rest of their lives living in a highly digital world. And if they're really curious about learning how to program or build an online business, that's cool. So I have mixed feelings about that. I think that for some kids it's very beneficial, but I don't take like an absolutist stance. So mixed feelings about Waldorf, but very, very pro the whimsical, beautiful, natural materials component of it. I think that's very lovely, and it was certainly a net positive in my childhood.
One of the things, and you can think I'm some softy beta male if you want, viewers, but when I saw the handwriting, we were looking at the schools and we were meeting with Betsy, and she shows me this handwriting book, this book of written things, and they learn cursive, which no one knows anymore, and mine is awful. I'm looking at this beautiful script, and she says, that's a 7th grade boy's handwriting, and I began to weep. Because it was like, oh my God, this is like I've entered another dimension, and okay, there's gnomes and fairies. I'll take it.
I do think there's actually something very powerful about that entering into a different dimension that I think a lot of the conversation around innovative education kind of misses. It like, I think that's really important for kids. I don't think like Waldorf schools are weird. The people who go to Waldorf schools can be very weird. Like it's not for everyone, and that's okay.
I'm not sure we can fairly throw weird around and not be like.
Well, I had a Waldorf inspired elementary education too. Like I'm right there with you. I think that transportational experience of moving between just complete aesthetics and sensibilities in your world is really important for kids' capacity to imagine and to fantasize and to think, to go back to the creativity thing, to think creatively. Mm-hmm. Children love fantasy books. They love imaginative books. They love like stories at all. They love losing themselves in play pretend for hours on end and being in an environment that allows for that whimsy and wonder and for that creative expression and exploration. Like you can learn to write in script. You can illustrate these stories that you're reading in beeswax crayon. You can learn how to knit a hat and then wear it to school every day if you want. You can knit a stuffed toy. You can dye silk scarves. Everybody's going to cook lunch together. Like,
none of the kids were allowed to wear any kind of like iconography or brands. Mm-hmm. So it all looked like almost taken out of the timeline.
I think there's something very powerful about that for kids. And I don't think that it has to be the Waldorf approach by any means, but I think you're facilitating a very powerful experience for your child if you're allowing them to extricate themselves from all of the cultural pressures and norms. And even like to your point, the anchors in time of where they are on the continuum, and you just kind of allow them to like float and explore just like in the human experience and their relationship to the natural world around them. Mm-hmm. That's very grounding in the long term, and it also helps them build that psychological muscle of being able to think very creatively and dynamically. And I think that's really valuable for kids, even if you're just setting up like you're homeschooling and you're setting up your home in a way where your kids can go disappear in the playroom all day and they can be medieval princesses and that's just what they're doing. And like you make them stew for lunch because that's what medieval princesses eat, they think, or whatever. And like they're waiting for their dragon to come home or, whatever games they want to play. Allowing for that is so developmentally beneficial.
So microschools. I'm kind of saving like the most exciting one for last because I love this model. Microschools sort of like scaled homeschooling, or think like a one-room schoolhouse for the 21st century. There's a huge microschool movement emerging right now. This is going to be a term that you're going to hear more and more. Microschools are basically like little one-room schoolhouses on a local level, often started by a parent or a teacher that wanted to exit the public system and do something else. And they'll start a microschool. And it's usually a mixed age classroom. It can span 4, 5, 6 grades. Often it's pretty small, like 8 to 10 kids, sometimes fewer, sometimes more, but like not as big as a 30-kid classroom. And kids are often using technological tools, which is why I say for one-room schoolhouse for the 21st century, like they're able to tap into the network and have a universe worth of resources at their fingertips, but they get the customization and personalization and small community of
having a teacher in a small classroom who can actually pay attention to them and a much smaller cohort of kids. And people are building micro schools all over the country in all different ways. There's a chain of micro schools being built out of Florida called Primer. Basically, they're trying to build like a replicable micro school model that's expanding right now through Florida, but eventually across the country. There's a network in Arizona called Prenda that is more of like, it's almost like a micro school incubator where parents can sign up to start apprentice school, and it's set up to run on ESA money, so education scholarship accounts, like state funding for schools.
So Florida and Arizona are probably the leading states in the country as far as letting the tax dollars that are extracted from you as a real estate holder be given to the student functionally by way of the parents, right? So
exactly.
It's not, oh, we take your tax money and give it to this like building built by the prisons and the teachers unions. No, you, the parent, take the money and put them in the school you want them to be put into. That's the Arizona. I think even more so.
There are 10 states now that have passed it. There's a pretty big wave right now. I'm hoping it sweeps most of the country, but Arizona's been the front runner of this.
It's also the way it's all working in, I think, the entire country of Sweden.
It's how it should be.
Yeah.
Milton Friedman totally how it should be. So of course it's good.
I think most people probably are familiar with the school choice movement as a concept, but it is amazing that it's controversial because it's like, well, this is the way all of college funding has always worked, including the beloved GI Bill. So this is only controversial because of corrupt vested interests like the teachers unions who want to take your taxpayer money and funnel it into their political candidates. Like, that's just a statement of fact. It's that, if I can rant for a little bit on
Please.
this, because so much of what we're talking about, and if I get a little angry, it's because I am. So much of what we're talking about and all these options aren't as widely available to as many parents as possible because our tax dollars are taken and forced into the broken system. And part of the reason why the system is so broken for so long is because it's a government-run monopoly. There's no reason for the government to run schools. It's not, in any theoretical sense, a thing that the government should do. It's not like there's a public good, oh, it's a tragedy of the commons, or there's negative externalities, all these like blackboard textbook, why should government get involved? None of that applies to schools. And yet it's only now that this is starting to be a thing, thankfully, where, oh, we're going to take your money in the name of access, let's say, fine. So that someone that doesn't have enough income to go to one of these schools can now be given a voucher or an education savings account and choose the school. So now you have the market mechanism. Now you have competition. Now you can vote with your feet, which is way more important than voting at the ballot box. Everything we're talking about up to this point in this very long and very important conversation presupposes the ability to choose. And do you want to say, I can go on ad nauseum about this, but for a moment, do you want to just stop and talk about like that fact, the school choice fact?
Yeah. I think you just did a great job teeing it all up. To your point that all of this presupposes your ability to choose. Functionally, you have the ability to choose. Legally, you have the ability to choose. The big barrier for most families is either logistical access or financial access. The logistical access problem is being solved in part by the internet. If you don't want your kids in public school, you have educational resources at your fingertips. It's going to require a little bit of know-how, a little bit of critical thinking to figure out how to assemble everything into an education, but you can build a plane as you're flying it. It's going to be a benefit to your kid because they're going to see you figuring it out and they're going to learn that skill too, which they'll carry through for a lifetime.
Into every single job they'll ever do until they die.
Exactly. That is solving the logistical problem. The fact that this is a burgeoning movement is also going to make leaps and bounds in solving the logistical access problem. Like micro schools, like we just mentioned, are cropping up all over the country at a very rapid pace. It's becoming easier and easier for a family to start one if they want. It's like accessibility on that front is expanding. The other big hurdle is that parents are already pouring tax dollars, if they're a property owner, into the
Or a
public school
renter,
system.
because it's baked into your rent.
Exactly. No matter where no matter how you're covering your housing, you're already contributing money into the public education system, and you don't always have a lot left over to put into your child's education by a different mode. We've written about this a number of times on Renegade Educator because this is something that I feel very strongly about, that like education does not have to be expensive. There are tons of free resources, and I like have written pieces where I kind of like walk you through, here's how to think about if you're looking for different options, like here's kind of how to think about assembling something for free or for very cheap. But choosing a school is hard and expensive. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that my son went to the Founders Acton Academy here in Austin. It was under 10 grand a year. Mm-hmm. His senior year here at San Juan Diego, under 6,500 for the year. So this isn't free, and for some people that's still too much money. But you can run great schools, and they don't have to be like the New York City cray town where kindergarten's 35 grand. Like, in fact, that school probably sucks, actually. It's probably like the most woke hellscape you can ever imagine, filled with people that all they care about is getting their kids into Columbia so they can root for genocide or whatever. I think maybe the hardest part with the homeschool conversation is who's home with the kids if both parents need to work.
Yeah, that
is a hard problem to solve. It's not really an education problem to solve per se.
No, it's a societal infrastructure problem. I think remote work is changing that very dramatically. I think the combination of remote work and the ESA movement is going to bring a lot of change in education. If one parent can work from home, they can be around for their kids. If their kid can be enrolled in something online and their kid doesn't have to be, getting direct attention throughout the day, or they're, on their iPad or their computer, like listening to Khan Academy or whatever, and then they're playing for the rest of the day. They're like building their robot in the garage or whatever. Like, the parent can be working, and that's, especially for kids that are a little bit older, that can be very, very sustainable. There also are a lot of school models that are being developed within the ESA price point, like Prenda that I just mentioned. They're designing their school model so that it costs, in Arizona, the ESA amount is $7,500 a year per student. So the school costs $7,500 a year. And they're like, we're going to figure out how to do this at this price point for like at the best quality possible. One of the other things that these have been some of my most controversial social media posts, which is saying something because I've had a lot of very controversial social media posts.
Where there's a giant political juggernaut of the teachers' unions, which are a primary funder of the Democratic Party, that which shouldn't even be allowed. It's completely crazy to me that you can have a system that is allowed to extract tax dollars and give it to any political party. That's like public sector unions shouldn't even exist. Like if FDR had his way, public sector unions wouldn't exist. But of course, there's a giant zombie horde that hates you and me and anyone that talks about changing the status quo in education. So, but continue.
Well, one of the most controversial things that I've ever talked about is the fact that I refuse to call homeschooling a privilege, and it drives me crazy that people do, because I find it so insulting to all of the homeschool families that I've ever met who had to make enormous sacrifices to make homeschooling work. I grew up mostly with homeschooling families that did not have a lot of financial resources. I grew up with families who lived in houses that were falling apart and drove 20-year-old cars so that they could homeschool their kids. I would sometimes see grandma at co-op because she was bringing the kids for the day because mom was working. There was two homeschooling families. The moms were best friends, and they both worked part-time jobs because neither of them could make it on a single on a single income, and they were able to stagger their work hours. So it was always one or the other of them working while the other one was watching the kids. I know a single mom who got a job at a nonprofit that would let her bring her kids to work, and they could sit and work on their school while she was working. Like, people figure it out, and they make enormous sacrifices to make it work. And I mean, it was not that long ago that we raised, 8 kids on a couple dollars a day. Like, things have changed and inflation has changed, and like, obviously $2 doesn't go where it used to, but
there is this reality that is hard. to hear, and it's maybe sounds callous to say, but it is like, well, yes, the cost of living has gone up relative to things. The government's taken over more of healthcare and education and turned it into expensive trash. So on one hand, it's hard to do this stuff if you're barely making ends meet. On the other hand, I do think we as adults and as parents have to take a step back, take a deep breath, and say, what are our priorities?
Yeah, you're making choices. Exactly.
My great-grandparents came and worked on a dock and had a grocery store and had tons of kids, and it was all really hard and messy and horrible, and it was harder than it is now. It was harder in 1920 to raise 6 kids in the ghetto in Philadelphia than it is now to work basically like 20 bucks an hour in America. And I know, like, I can be rightly called an elitist for saying that, but I also think it's true. And I think we have to make decisions about our priorities as a family. And if you have kids, you have to make this your priority, in my opinion. You have to. You have to say, I'm not going to turn my kids over to a broken, corrupt system. I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to make it work one way or another. And to those who say it's a privilege or try to like call us elitists for wanting our kids to do better, I think we can see what you're doing there. We know who you're for. We know who you're for, And
it's not the kids.
It's not the kids. It's the adults. You're carrying water for some pretty gross adults. Where is your biggest source of optimism? You were talking about micro schools, but at the biggest possible scale. We live in pessimistic times. But our kids are our future. How they're educated is the future of how they'll think. Where's your source of optimism?
I'm kind of a chronic optimist, so I have a lot of sources of optimism. I mean, on a daily basis, it's just interacting with a kid, really. Like you interact with a small child and you watch the wonder in their eyes and their excitement as they start to piece together how the whole world fits together. And it makes me so optimistic because that's how we're wired. Like every new child that comes into the world is curious about it, is excited about it, has the capacity without anyone helping them to learn how to walk and talk and synthesize information and figure out how this whole place works and figure out how to navigate in it. And we're getting in the way of that in the way that we educate our kids. But we don't innately have a problem. We're just causing one. And if we stop causing one, we won't have a problem anymore. And that makes me very optimistic. Like being around kids, complete white pill. I'm also really optimistic about how much momentum there is in the alternative education world. There's been, since 2020, there's been a huge influx of VC funding into education. There are a lot of projects getting backing and trying to build alternatives at scale. The number of homeschoolers has risen astronomically and has continued to rise even after schools reopened post-COVID. Some of the estimates that I've seen are as high as 10% of American kids are now being homeschooled, which is insane. Like when I was growing up, that didn't seem possible. And that's so exciting. Like parents want something different. They want something better. And they're starting to realize that it's a thing that's in grasp. The number of alternative programs that are being developed and expanding is so exciting to me because, again, like I don't think that there's one solution to this problem. I think that there are many. And the fact that people are taking very different stabs at the problem and developing very different things and having amazing success stories coming out of these programs in schools is so exciting to me. And just the fact that like conversations like the one we're having are happening more and more frequently. Like people are starting to feel like something is wrong. They're realizing it, and they're also realizing that something better is possible, and they're talking about it and they're figuring it out, and people are getting excited about it. And I really think there's a very significant wave of momentum that's building. And I think you have to keep building. It has to keep moving forward. Waves ebb and flow if the momentum doesn't continue. But if it continues, I truly think that the way that we educate our kids, just like the default status quo path, will no longer feel like the default. It will not feel like a given. People will question whether or not it's actually the right thing to do very commonly. And I'm very excited for that day to arrive, but I really think it's possible. And that makes me very optimistic.
I ask this of every guest. The show is called Dad Saves America because I believe that our role as parents is probably the area we have the best chance to impact the future of the country, because our kids are the future of the country, and because our kids are the area where our actions matter the most. And so that's the heroic role of dad. How do you think about your role in this American story?
I do what I do because I grew up and I went out into the working world and I started interacting with people on a daily basis who came from a very different background than I did in terms of their education. And I realized that I had gotten extraordinarily and stupidly lucky. And I knew that I had gotten so lucky in part because my dad was the advocate for homeschooling me. It was his idea. And then my mom did most of the homeschooling, but she got on board second. My dad was like, I don't think we should put her in public school. I think we should do something else. And he and my mom made that choice because they had seen other people do it successfully. And I remember my mom researching and reading about homeschoolers and the paths they'd been on and what they did as adults. And that was what galvanized them to say, this could work. We could pull this off. And I knew that I'd gotten so lucky, and I wanted to talk about the experience that I'd had in hopes that maybe the next parent would see it and it would like pay it forward. And then the more I talked about it, the more I realized like, wait, this is actually really important and I should make this like my work to do. But it's very personal for me. And, I'm not a mother yet, but I've been designing my career since I was 20 years old in a way where I can do work that I love and homeschool my kids. That's always been the vision. That's always been the goal. And, I want to raise children someday that are also happy, thriving, creative, curious, joyful members of society. And I feel like, we live in a world that's often very pessimistic and very cold and very harsh and very unkind. And I think that the work that I do talking about education is very important, but I also think who I am when I walk into a room is just as important. And so I feel like being able to be that as a mother someday and raise children that way, and like, I don't know, maybe I'll start a homeschooling pod or something. I'm kind of a weird entrepreneurial, like I kind of can't help myself, so we'll see. But like, there are so many different ways of putting that out into the world. And I have other ideas that like don't need to go on record yet, but of like other things that I'm excited to build in the future. Like stay tuned, you'll see. But the conversations I host on my podcast and the tweets that I put out and the writing that I do, I hope, like, I love the name of your podcast because it gets to the root of what I also believe, that America is a culture. And that's what made it so great. And that the culture is always a grassroots thing. And it is the individuals that are going to save it and preserve it. And as many parents as I can help, the better. So I don't know. For now, that's my answer. Hopefully when you ask me, if you ask me again in 5 years, I'll have a better answer because the vision will have expanded. But right now, that's the work.
Hannah, thanks for being on Dad Saves America.
Thank you for having me.